My husband fired me at 9:10 on a Monday morning. At 9:14, his mistress started moving her things into my office. 4 minutes. She had boxes ready. At 10 o'clock, the two of them walked into the boardroom, expecting me to beg for my job. Ethan had his speech prepared, his lawyer briefed, his story polished. The unstable wife, the financial irregularities, the difficult but necessary decision. Instead, I placed a sealed envelope in front of every director at that table, sat down without opening my laptop, and asked the company attorney to read page 17 aloud. That was the moment my husband discovered three things. I knew about the affair. I knew where the money had gone, and the company he thought belonged to him had never, not for one single day of the last 10 years, been entirely his. My name is Claire Morgan. For a decade, everyone at Westbridge Systems believed I was the CEO's wife who got handed the finance job. By the end of this story, you'll know what I actually was, what was written on page 17, and why. When they finally offered me the whole company, I did something nobody in that room saw coming, least of all my husband. To understand that Monday, you have to come back 10 years with me, to a rented office above a dry cleaner, where Westbridge Systems was 2 desks, a whiteboard, and a married couple who still ate dinner off the same plate to save on dishes. Ethan was the dreamer. I want to be honest about him, because this story is worthless if I pretend he was always a villain. He wasn't. He was magnetic, brilliant with people, the kind of man who could walk into a room of skeptics and walk out with their checkbooks. He believed in Westbridge the way other people believe in God. And I loved him for it. I was the other half of the machine, the quiet half. I built the financial system, the models, the discipline. He sold the dream. I made sure the dream could pay rent. In year 4, the dream stopped paying rent. A client collapse, a funding round that fell through, and suddenly we were 11 weeks from insolvency, laying off people at Christmas. And Ethan, my confident, magnetic Ethan, sat on our kitchen floor at 2 in the morning and cried into his hands. Every investor had said no. There was exactly one pool of money left in our world: my inheritance. My mother had died 2 years earlier and left me more than anyone knew, because my mother, a woman who'd been quietly underestimated her entire life, had been quietly brilliant with money her entire life. It was mine. My history, my safety, the last thing she ever gave me. I put almost all of it into Westbridge, and it saved the company. But here's the part that matters. The part everyone in the story forgot, except me. I didn't hand it over like a wife supporting her man. I did it like my mother's daughter. My lawyer structured the rescue as an investment, held through a private trust, and in exchange, that trust received 48% of Westbridge's voting shares, with conditions attached, protections, the kind of clauses lawyers write and optimists never read. The paperwork was signed by me, by Ethan, and by our very first outside investor and board chair, a steel-spined woman named Margaret Hale. 63 years old now, first money into Westbridge, and famous for exactly one management philosophy: people lie, documents don't. Then Ethan asked me for one favor, and I gave it to him, and it became the biggest mistake of my life. He asked that we keep the arrangement quiet. Not secret from regulators, everything was legal and filed, but invisible in the story of the company. Investors, he said, want a founder hero, one face, one vision, and if they knew the CEO's wife owned nearly half the votes, it would complicate every future round. It's just optics, Claire. We know the truth. That's what matters. I believe that. I want you to sit with how reasonable it sounded at a kitchen table between two people in love. So the money became invisible. The trust became a line item nobody examined, and I became a supporting character in my own investment. 10 years passed. Westbridge grew to 400 employees, and the story got rewritten the way stories do, one retelling at a time, until Ethan was the visionary who built it all through the hard years, and I was the wife he'd generously given the CFO chair. New hires assumed it, the press printed it. At a company retreat, I once heard a young manager explain to an intern, "That's Claire. She's finance. She's married to Ethan. That's kind of how she got here." I laughed it off that night. Margaret Hale didn't. She pulled me aside at that same retreat, wineglass in hand, and gave me the warning I'd hear again in my worst hour. "Claire," she said, "invisible ownership is a loan you make to someone else's ego. One day you'll want it back, and they will genuinely believe it was never yours." I told her our marriage wasn't a boardroom. She looked at me the way you look at someone standing on train tracks and said, "Everything is a boardroom eventually." I helped Ethan become the face of the company. What I didn't know was that one day he would use that face to erase me from the story completely. And the erasing had already begun, quietly, on a Tuesday, with a hotel invoice that didn't add up. The invoice came through in March. A conference trip to Denver, one traveler registered in our system, Ethan Morgan, but the hotel bill showed 2 rooms, booked together, adjoining, and one of them had been upgraded to a suite with a charge for 2 robes. I'm a CFO. I don't read expense reports for gossip. I read them for patterns. And I filed that one away in the part of my brain my mother trained, the part that never sleeps. Because other things had been accumulating, small as dust, Ethan traveling more and lighter somehow, happier leaving than arriving home. A new passcode on his phone after 6 years of the same one. The way he'd started scheduling client dinners on nights I had board prep. And the way he talked about Vanessa Reed. Vanessa was our communications director, 31, promoted fast, and let me say clearly what I told the board later. She was genuinely talented. That's what made her dangerous. She understood something most people never learn, that in a modern company, the story about the work can matter more than the work, and whoever controls the story controls the room. Ethan had started praising her in executive meetings with a specific warmth, inviting her into strategy sessions that had nothing to do with communications, quoting her. And in April, at our leadership dinner, I saw the bracelet, a thin gold band with a small emerald, distinctive, Italian. I knew it instantly because 2 years earlier, Ethan had shown it to me on his phone, said he was thinking of it for my birthday. My birthday came and went with a gift card. The bracelet was on Vanessa Reed's wrist, and when she caught me looking, she didn't cover it. She turned it slightly so it caught the light. I said nothing. I drove home, and I remember my hands on the wheel perfectly steady, and a voice in my head, not my mother's this time, mine, saying, "Gather, don't react. Whatever this is, it is bigger than a bracelet." I found out how much bigger on a Thursday morning in May, when Vanessa made the mistake that saved my life. She sent an email to the wrong Claire. There were 2 Claires in our directory, me and a junior designer, and autocomplete did what autocomplete does. The document landed in my inbox at 8:03 a.m., and its title, which I will remember on my deathbed, was Leadership Transition, Post-CFO Separation. It was a communications plan, polished, thorough, ready. It laid out how the company would announce my departure for personal reasons, how Ethan would take temporary control of finance, how Vanessa would run internal messaging through the sensitive period, pre-drafted answers denying any leadership conflict, a timeline, talking points for managers, for the board, for the press, if it came to that, every phase of my removal storyboarded like a product launch. And then I looked at the document properties and my blood went from cold to something colder. Created 6 weeks earlier. 6 weeks, while Ethan was still kissing me goodbye in the mornings. This wasn't an affair that had gotten complicated. This was a project with a project manager, and I was the deliverable. I sat very still for a long time. Then I forwarded the email to a private archive, deleted the forward from the sent folder, replied nothing, and did what I do. I opened the books. Took me 9 nights working from home on records I still had every legal right to access, to find the second layer, and the second layer was where the affair stopped being a heartbreak and became a crime. The private dinners, coded as client entertainment, the luxury hotel suites buried in conference budgets. And the big one, the one with real weight, a series of communications contracts, unusually large, awarded over 8 months to a newly formed agency called Meridian Story Group, an agency with a thin website, no case studies, and a founder whose name meant nothing to me until I found his photograph. Marcus Reed, Vanessa's brother. All told, more than $800,000 of Westbridge money had flowed into the affair and the family pipeline around it. And then, on the 9th night, I found the part that was meant for me. Every one of those questionable approvals, every dinner, every contract carried an authorization code in the system. My code, my login, sign-offs I had never made, on dates I could prove I was elsewhere, entered by someone with administrative access, which at Westbridge meant a list of exactly 3 people, and I was looking at the other 2 in our wedding photos. They weren't just stealing. They were building a paper trail that ended at my desk. Ethan didn't plan to leave the marriage. He planned to leave me holding a prosecutable file, unemployable, discredited, and too busy defending my own name to ever ask questions about his. He wasn't divorcing a wife, he was disposing of a witness. I needed to know one thing before I moved. Were they watching the trap they'd built actively right now? So I tested it. I created a payment request in the system. A fake, harmless, going nowhere, no real transaction behind it, but tagged with a small tracking marker only I would recognize. If they were mining my authorization trail for ammunition, they'd find it fast. It took 4 days. On the 5th, our internal message logs, which as CFOI had audit access to, showed Vanessa asking Ethan one question about my fake payment. Is this one usable? Can we show Claire approved it without review? Usable. My husband's mistress asking if my sabotaged name was usable. That word ended whatever was left of my mercy. What I did next, I did quietly and in the right order. And if you ever find yourself in a war like this one, the order matters more than the anger. I called the trust attorney, my mother's old firm, and had them prepare certified copies of the 10-year-old investment agreement. I called Margaret Hale and asked for a private meeting and told her one sentence. I believe financial records are being falsified under my name, and I watched 63 years of documents don't lie sit up straight. I engaged an independent forensic accounting firm, paid personally, outside the company. And notice what I never mentioned to any of them. The affair. Not once. Because the moment you say affair, you become the jealous wife, and everything after that is emotion. But say, falsified records, and you're a fiduciary reporting a crime. I refused to hand them a story about my heart. I handed them a story about their money. The last piece found me on its own. Leo Grant, our internal auditor, 34, careful, the kind of man who triple checks a lunch receipt, asked to meet me in a parking garage like something out of a bad movie, and confessed with his hands shaking. Ethan had summoned him twice. There was a report drafted, ready for Leo's signature, stating that the auditor had discovered I'd approved improper expenditures, concealed a conflict of interest, and hidden it from leadership. A promotion was mentioned if he signed. Consequences were implied if he didn't. Leo hadn't signed, but he hadn't reported it either because he had a mortgage and a new baby and a CEO with a long memory, and I understood him completely. I didn't ask him to be a hero. I asked him to do two small, survivable things. Keep the original, unaltered audit files somewhere safe, and write down every instruction he received with dates, that's all. Heroism, it turns out, can be broken into installments. By the first week of June, the envelope was ready. And I do mean an envelope. One master file, duplicated, sealed, sitting in my attorney's office like a loaded instrument. I could have fired first. I had the votes, and by then I knew it. But my mother's daughter wanted one thing more than safety. I wanted them to commit, publicly, formally, irreversibly, in front of the board, so that no version of this could ever be retold as a marital spat. Let him swing first, Margaret had said. A man mid-swing cannot cover himself. So I went to work every day for 3 more weeks, smiled in hallways, sat across from my husband at dinner, and waited for him to fire me. On the second Monday of June at 9:10 in the morning, he finally did. He did it in the small conference room, with HR on one side and the company's outside counsel on the other, and he used his investor voice, the warm, regretful one. Claire, the board has lost confidence in you. There are financial irregularities we can no longer ignore. He slid a suspension letter across the table. Effective, immediately. Access revoked. Escorted from the building. No contact with employees. He'd rehearsed it, I could tell, probably in a mirror, probably with her. And through the glass wall behind him, down the corridor, I could see Vanessa, waiting, failing to fully hold down the corners of her mouth. 4 minutes after security walked me out of my office, and I know it was 4 minutes because 3 different employees texted me she was carrying her boxes in. 4 minutes, she'd had them packed. If you ever doubt this was premeditated, hold on to those boxes. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I gathered my coat, and at the door, I asked one question. The 10 o'clock board meeting is still on? Ethan allowed himself a small, generous smile and said, You'll have a chance to explain yourself, but I'd say the decision is largely made. And I said, Good. I wouldn't want you to miss it. He heard mercy in that. He should have heard a countdown. At 10 o'clock, the full board convened, 7 directors, Margaret Hale in the chair, counsel present, and Ethan presented his case with genuine skill because, I told you, the man can sell. Mismanagement, irregular approvals, all bearing my authorization code. A slide, tasteful, regretful, about separating personal matters from company decisions. He moved for my formal termination and note this, for review of my voting rights, which tells you he'd finally grown curious about the trust. 6 years too late. Vanessa sat behind him, listed on the agenda as communications advisor for the transition. They had matching water bottles. I remember thinking, They've already merged. Then it was my turn, and I walked in with no laptop, no slides, no lawyer beside me, just a stack of sealed envelopes, and I placed one in front of each director and one in front of Ethan, and I sat down and said, "Before we discuss my employment, the board should reacquaint itself with a document it executed 10 years ago. Council has the original. I'd ask him to read from page 17. Ethan's face at the words page 17 is a photograph I keep in a private room in my mind. He didn't know what was on page 17. He had signed it in a year when he would have signed anything, and he had spent a decade telling a story in which that page didn't exist until he believed the story himself. Council read, "The trust holding 48% of Westbridge's voting shares." And then the clause my mother's lawyers had insisted on, the one written for exactly this room, on exactly this morning. In the event the chief executive is credibly implicated in fraud, misappropriation of company assets, or concealment of a conflict of interest, executive authority may be temporarily suspended pending independent investigation by consent of the trust and any one independent director. The trust was me. And the independent director whose signature already sat on that 10-year-old page, who had warned me at a retreat with a wine glass in her hand, was sitting at the head of the table with her reading glasses on, unsurprised, because Margaret Hale is never surprised, only confirmed. Ethan started to speak, and I want to give you his exact first sentence because it was so perfectly him. "Claire, whatever that document says, the board just terminated your position." And I said the sentence I had been saving for 10 years without knowing it. "You fired me as an employee, Ethan. Unfortunately for you, you never had the authority to fire me as an owner." Then I opened the evidence, and I did it in the order I'd planned for weeks, because order is meaning. I did not start with the affair. I started with their money. The Denver invoices, 2 rooms, 1 registered traveler, the Meridian Story group contracts, $800,000, side by side with the incorporation record listing Marcus Reed, and a photograph confirming exactly whose brother he was. The forged approval trail, my authorization code on transactions timestamped to days I could prove, with boarding passes and board minutes, I was in other cities. The forensic firm's preliminary report confirming the entries were made from administrative accounts, plural, that were not mine. Leo's written record dated of being pressured to sign a falsified audit with the unsigned draft attached, and I watched 3 directors reread that one twice. And then the transition plan, created 6 weeks before my firing, professionally storyboarding my erasure with Vanessa's name in the document properties. And only then, at the very end, did I take out one photograph, Ethan and Vanessa leaving the same hotel suite, and lay it flat on the table. And I said, quietly, because quiet was all it needed, "The affair isn't why you're being removed. It only explains why you were willing to commit everything else." Nobody spoke. Somewhere down the table, a director closed his eyes, and then Vanessa made her move, because unlike Ethan, she could read a room dying, and she went for the exit she'd probably always kept in mind. Her voice shook exactly the right amount. She said she was junior, overwhelmed, that she had acted entirely on the CEO's instructions, that she'd been afraid to refuse him. It was good. It might even have worked. Except communications directors write things down. I slid one more page across the table, her own email, to Ethan, months old, in which she, not he, proposed using the financial file to remove me. She who suggested routing contracts to family where auditors wouldn't think to look. She who drafted, in advance, the statement smearing me as unstable in case I resisted. Strategy, in her own words, in her own font. Vanessa turned to Ethan then, and this is the moment I almost pitied her. She turned to him for rescue in front of everyone, and my husband, cornered, calculating his own survival at the speed he'd once calculated valuations, looked at the board and said, "She did everything herself. I was misled." 8 words. I watched Vanessa's face as she received them, and I recognized the expression because I'd worn it in May at 8:03 in the morning, reading an email meant for another Claire. So I said the last thing I ever intend to say to her. "You thought betraying me made you his partner? It only made you his next scapegoat." The vote took 11 minutes. Executive authority suspended, Ethan escorted from the building by the same security officer who had walked me out at 9:20. And if you think the universe doesn't have a sense of humor, it was even the same elevator. Vanessa was suspended alongside him. Both referred to the independent investigation, and the investigation, over the following months, confirmed everything and found more, because these things always find more. And then the board turned to me, and Margaret Hale, chair of chairs, said the words, "Half of you have been waiting this whole story to hear. Claire, the board would ask you to serve as interim chief executive." I said no, not a bitter no, a precise one. Because I had spent 3 weeks thinking about that exact offer, and here's what I knew. If I took Ethan's chair that morning, with my 48% and my sealed envelopes, then to 400 employees, this would forever be the story of a marriage that ate a company, a wife who out-schemed a husband, and I would spend years being whispered about in the same hallways, just with a better office. Worse, I would be governing with the weapons I'd used to survive. And I had watched from very close range what that does to a person. Ethan didn't start as a villain either. He started as a man who believed the company was him. I wasn't going to end as a woman who believed the company owed me. So I set conditions instead. An independent CEO recruited from outside to run Westbridge through the investigation. A full audit of every contract Meridian had touched. Formal protection in writing for Leo Grant and every employee who had cooperated. Promotions where deserved, and Leo's was deserved. And one more, the one that mattered most to me. A public, documented correction of the company's history. The real founding story, the rescue, the trust, my mother's money on the record, in the corporate history, permanently. Not for my ego, for the next version of me in the next company, being told that invisibility is good optics. The board accepted all 4. And then, months later, when the investigation closed and the lawyers exhaled, I did the thing Ethan had feared most and understood least. He had spent that whole season convinced I was maneuvering to take Westbridge from him, because that is the only move a man like him can imagine, seizing the thing. Instead, I activated the buyout provision in the trust, sold my 48% back through the mechanism my mother's lawyers had built a decade earlier, and walked away from Westbridge Systems entirely. The marriage was already gone. The divorce was mercifully boring. He had no appetite for a courtroom by then. But I didn't want the company either, and it took me a long time to understand why. So let me try to give it to you straight. That company had become an extension of that marriage. Every hallway was an argument I'd already won or lost. You cannot heal inside the evidence. The money from the sale, a number with more commas than my mother would have believed, went into something new. A fund, my name on the door this time, that invests in companies with a specific kind of founder. Women who built something real, put in the money or the work or both, and then watch themselves get quietly edited out of their own story. We check one thing before we invest that no other fund checks. We read the cap table next to the press coverage, and when the two don't match, we go find out who's missing. You'd be stunned how often someone is. For 10 years, I thought winning meant holding on to what I built. And if you take one thing from my story, take this. Sometimes winning isn't taking back the chair they stole from you. Sometimes winning is standing up from that table with your name, your truth, and your future intact, and building a longer table somewhere they can't reach. Protect your ownership, yes. Get it in writing, always. Love is not a filing system. But protect your story just as fiercely, because I'm living proof that they can't actually take either one. They can only convince you, quietly, year by year, that it was never yours. Don't let them. Page 17 exists because a woman who loved me refused to let me be careless. Be that woman, for yourself or for someone else. If this story meant something to you, hit the like button because it genuinely tells me these longer, deeper stories are worth making. Subscribe and turn on notifications because next week I'm telling the story of a janitor who was fired for being too old. 2 weeks before the company discovered he was the only person alive who knew the code that ran their entire factory. And I want your honest answer in the comments on the hardest question in this story. Claire refused the CEO chair. Would you have taken it and made them all live under you, or walked away like she did? There's no wrong answer, but the split in last week's comments genuinely surprised me, and I read every single one. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next story.